They didn't scream when they locked the door. They didn't even hesitate. Our own son shoved us into the basement of the house we built, with our lives, and bolted it shut. Cold stone, damp air, darkness thick enough to swallow sound. And just when despair settled in, when 40 years of motherhood collapsed into silence, my husband leaned close and whispered something that stopped my breath entirely. Be quiet. They don't know what's hidden behind that wall. What secret could survive 4 decades of marriage? What truth could turn betrayal into power? And how does a quiet, forgotten woman become the most dangerous person in the room, without ever raising her voice? This is not just a story about inheritance. It's about identity, about legacy, about the terrifying moment when a mother realizes her child is no longer her child, but an enemy. And once the truth comes out, there's no undoing what follows. The house didn't just stand there. It breathed. That's the only way to explain it. In the mornings, when sunlight slipped through the pecan trees and spilled across the floors, the walls seemed to inhale, filling themselves with warmth and memory. And at night, when the beams creaked and settled, it felt like the house was exhaling, releasing the day's worries with a tired sigh. I had lived inside that rhythm for 40 years, long enough to forget where the house ended and where I began. It was built by my father-in-law, with the stubborn hope that generations would pass through it. Children running barefoot, grandchildren learning to read at the same table, laughter echoing long after the voices were gone. I believed in that hope. I folded my life into it. Every meal cooked, every repair made, every quiet sacrifice stitched me deeper into those walls. This wasn't just property. It was proof that a life had been lived with purpose. Motherhood arrived inside that house like a promise. I taught my son to chop carrots at the kitchen counter, his small hands gripping a dull safety knife, declaring himself a chef while laughing at his own seriousness. Those sounds, his laughter, my laughter, never really left. They lingered in the grain of the table, in the scuffed floors, in the chair where his grandfather once read newspapers aloud. And when my husband's health began to fail, when the world shrank to doctor visits and medication schedules, it felt natural to stay. This was where family stayed together, where loyalty meant showing up without being asked. I stepped away from my own dreams without resentment, or so I told myself. Some sacrifices feel noble when you don't imagine they'll be used against you later. The shift was slow, almost polite at first. Our son and his wife moved in temporarily, bringing suitcases that turned into furniture, opinions that turned into rules. Rooms changed, air changed. The house began to feel crowded in ways that had nothing to do with space. Familiar objects were moved aside, replaced with things that didn't belong to the past or the future, just the present they wanted. And still, I stayed quiet. Mothers do that. We convince ourselves that patience is the same as strength, that silence is love, that endurance will be rewarded. But houses notice these things. They remember who laid the foundation and who only arrived once it was finished. Even as my place in my own home grew smaller, the walls seemed to watch, as if waiting for something inevitable. What I didn't understand then, what I couldn't afford to understand, was that entitlement doesn't arrive loudly. It whispers, it smiles, it calls itself practicality, convenience, responsibility. It looks at your life's work and asks for the keys as if it's doing you a favor. I believed we were still family. I believed blood and history carried weight. But the house knew better. It had seen generations come and go. It had survived wars, grief, births, and funerals. and deep inside its foundation, behind stone and mortar, it held secrets meant for moments when belief collapses. The kind of moments when love stops being protection and becomes the very thing you must survive. At first, it sounded reasonable. That's how entitlement usually enters a room, not by force, but by logic. We're just trying to help. It's easier this way. You shouldn't have to worry about these things anymore. The words came wrapped in concern, served with smiles and casual reassurance. My son spoke about responsibility the way people do when they've already decided what belongs to them. His wife spoke about efficiency, about modern living, about how things should be done now. And I listened, nodding, absorbing it all, because somewhere deep inside me lived the old instinct. If I stay calm, if I stay kind, this will pass. But gratitude has a shelf life when it's mixed with impatience. Slowly, help began to feel like supervision. Suggestions turned into corrections. And before I realized it, I was being managed in the very house where I had once made every decision without asking anyone's permission. It wasn't one big moment. It never is. It was a chair moved without asking. A meal criticized with a sigh. A sentence that began with, "Don't you think it would be better if..." and ended with a decision already made. I noticed how often my name was replaced with a tone. Patient, condescending, final. How conversations happened around me instead of with me. My son stopped looking up from his phone when he spoke, as if eye contact was no longer necessary. And his wife, always polite, always distant, addressed me the way one addresses hired help or fragile glass, never cruel enough to protest, never warm enough to trust. I told myself this was stress, that caregiving changes people, that I should be understanding. After all, I had taught my son to be confident. I had taught him to take charge. I just hadn't realized he would practice those lessons on me. What hurt the most wasn't the control. It was the certainty behind it. The way they spoke as if the future had already been agreed upon, papers discussed, plans hinted at, a house spoken of as something waiting to be transferred, not protected. When inheritance was mentioned, it wasn't framed as loss or grief, but as bureaucracy, as if my existence had already been reduced to a formality that simply hadn't been processed yet. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Because a mother can forgive carelessness, she can forgive impatience. But being erased while still breathing, that is a different kind of wound. One that doesn't bleed, but burns. Still, I stayed quiet. I stayed because I believed silence might restore balance. Because I believed family still meant something unspoken but sacred. And because admitting the truth, that gratitude, had hardened into ownership, that love had curdled into calculation, would have meant accepting a terrifying possibility, that the child I raised no longer saw me as his mother, but as an obstacle. The house felt heavier during those days, the air thicker. Even the walls seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. Because when gratitude turns into entitlement, it doesn't stop on its own. It escalates, and it always demands proof of power. The only question left was how far they were willing to go, and whether I would recognize the moment when silence was no longer survival, but surrender. The argument didn't explode. It congealed. That's the only way to describe it. Thick, cold, and inevitable. We were standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where my son once announced he wanted to be a chef, where my husband used to lean against the counter pretending not to steal dumplings from the pot. Now the air felt tight, stripped of warmth. My son spoke in a tone I barely recognized, flat, irritated, impatient. Papers were mentioned again, signatures, simplifying things. avoiding problems later. He didn't look at me when he said it, as if the words themselves were more important than the person he was speaking to. When I said no, quietly, clearly, the room seemed to freeze. His wife leaned forward, eyes sharp, already calculating. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a discussion. It was a test, and I had just failed it. Then my husband appeared in the doorway, frail, unsteady, but alert in a way he hadn't been for weeks. He had heard everything. His voice, when it came, was weak, but the words landed like a hammer. "You are a disgrace." One sentence, that was all. And it snapped something in our son. I saw it happen. The flash of wounded pride, the humiliation twisting into rage. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He acted, hands grabbed, orders barked. The house that had once held us so gently suddenly turned hostile, its long hallway feeling narrower with every step. I tried to speak, to reason. But reason has no place once entitlement feels threatened. The basement door loomed ahead, heavy and ancient. When it opened, the smell of damp stone rushed up to meet us, cold, unforgiving, final. The shove wasn't violent. That was somehow worse. It was controlled, deliberate, practiced. My son pushed us inside like misplaced furniture, as if this was simply a logistical problem being solved. The door slammed, the bolt slid into place, and just like that, the house went silent. No footsteps, no voices, just darkness and breath. I sat on the stone steps, clutching my husband to keep him from slipping, my mind refusing to accept what had just happened. Not strangers, not thieves. Our own child, locked us in our own home. 40 years of motherhood collapsed into that single sound, the final click of the bolt. I waited for panic, for screaming, for tears. But what came instead was numbness so deep, it felt like falling asleep while standing upright. That was when my husband leaned close, his lips almost touching my ear, and whispered words that cut through the darkness like a blade. "Be quiet," he said. "They don't know what's hidden behind that wall." I froze. Not from fear, but from shock. In all our years together, I had never heard that tone in his voice. Not weak, not confused, focused, intent. Above us, footsteps moved away. A car engine started. And then nothing. We were alone, locked in the stone belly of the house, abandoned by the people who had claimed it as theirs. And yet, for the first time that day, despair loosened its grip, because whatever my husband was hiding, whatever secret had waited decades for this exact moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The door they had closed was not the end. It was the beginning of something they could never control. The basement was colder once the silence settled. Not just the kind of cold that seeps through stone, but the kind that crawls inward, tightening around the chest. I helped my husband down the steps slowly, each one an effort, each breath shallow and deliberate. The only light came from a thin, pale strip slipping under the door above us, barely enough to outline the shapes of old shelves and forgotten jars. This space had always been practical, storage, not sanctuary. And yet my husband moved with purpose, guiding me past the shelves, past the places I thought I knew, toward the far wall. He rested his palm against the rough masonry, breathing hard. "My father showed me this when I was 18, he whispered, "for an emergency. I never thought. I hoped." His voice trailed off, heavy with years of restraint. He told me where to press, one stone, indistinguishable from the others. I hesitated, half expecting nothing to happen, half afraid of what might. When I pushed, the brick shifted inward with a quiet scrape that felt far too loud in the silence. Behind it, a dark hollow opened like a waiting mouth. Inside, my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a small tin box, light, worn, ordinary in every way that matters until it isn't. We sat side by side on the steps, the box resting between us like a third presence. My husband's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were no jewels, no money, just folded papers, yellowed and fragile, carrying the weight of something that had been waiting decades to be spoken aloud. The first document was a birth certificate. The name on it was not the name I had known for 40 years. Different place, different story, a prison hospital, a father I had never heard of. When my husband said, "That's me," the world tilted. Not shattered, tilted. As if the axis of everything I understood had shifted by a few degrees, enough to change the direction of every memory. Adoption papers followed, official seals, dry language, and then a letter, written in my father-in-law's hand. I read it slowly, my eyes struggling in the dim light, my heart racing ahead of the words. It spoke of loyalty, of protection, of a man erased by history, and a promise made to save his child by giving him a new name, a new life, a shield strong enough to survive a cruel world. The name my son worshipped, the name my husband carried like armor. It was never blood, it was mercy. When I finished reading, something inside me went still, not broken, clear. All the years of sacrifice, the quiet endurance, the insults swallowed for the sake of peace. Suddenly they rearranged themselves into understanding. I had worked with archives once. I knew the power of documents, how paper could outlive people, how truth could wait patiently until it was needed most. What sat in that tin box wasn't just a family secret. It was leverage, not the kind that screams for revenge, but the kind that restores balance. In the darkness of that basement, locked away and forgotten, I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt awake, and as my husband leaned against me, exhausted, finally asleep, I understood something that would guide every step that followed. The people upstairs believed they held all the power. They had no idea that the foundation beneath their feet belonged to the past, and the past had just handed me the future. When they finally unlocked the basement door, light flooded in as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No apology, no hesitation. Just a smug, almost bored curiosity, as though they were checking on furniture left in storage too long. My son asked if we had thought it over. That was the phrase he chose. Not "are you all right," not "I'm sorry." Thought it over. In that moment, I saw how completely he had separated himself from us. We were no longer parents. We were variables in a calculation he believed he had already solved. I stood up slowly, my voice steady, my face calm, and agreed to make a call for care. He mistook composure for surrender. He didn't see the quiet certainty forming behind my eyes. Because while he believed the basement had broken me, it had actually finished assembling something I didn't yet have a name for. In the days that followed, I became invisible by design. I cooked. I cleaned. I moved through the house like a shadow. Efficient, silent, unremarkable. And that was exactly how they wanted it. People who believe they've won stop being careful. They speak freely. They plan loudly. I listened. I watched. They talked about tearing down walls, selling books, redesigning rooms as if history were clutter, as if memory were an inconvenience, and every word confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about care or responsibility. It was about ownership, about claiming a name and the power that came with it, without understanding the cost of wearing it. My son spoke of legacy the way people speak of brands, something to be leveraged, polished, expanded. He had no idea that the very name he was exploiting rested on a truth fragile enough to destroy him if handled correctly. Names are strange things. They can elevate or erase, open doors or slam them shut. For my husband, his name had been protection, a borrowed shield that allowed him to live freely. For my son, it became entitlement. He built his identity on it, his confidence, his social standing, his sense of superiority. He never questioned it, never wondered why some doors opened so easily for him, why certain people listened when he spoke, why mistakes were forgiven. And that blind certainty became his greatest weakness, because when a name is worn without understanding its weight, it becomes brittle. One truth, just one, can fracture it completely. And I held that truth, folded neatly in a tin box, waiting. I didn't feel anger anymore. That surprised me. What replaced it was colder and sharper, clarity. This wasn't about punishing a son. It was about reclaiming reality, about correcting a story that had been rewritten without consent. Lies don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they wear familiar faces and speak in affectionate tones. But once you see them for what they are, you can't unsee them. And I had seen enough. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer heavy. It felt poised, as if it understood what was coming. Blood may create families, but names create power. And lies, when exposed, don't just fall apart. They collapse everything, built on top of them. All that remained was timing, and I was no longer in a hurry. Silence, I learned, is misunderstood. People think it means weakness, surrender, confusion. My son and his wife certainly did. In their minds, my quiet compliance confirmed their victory. They stopped watching me, stopped lowering their voices. They discussed renovations over breakfast, legal details over dinner, my future as if it were already decided, an item on a checklist. And I let them. I moved through the house with the same measured calm, responding when spoken to, asking nothing. What they didn't realize was that silence can be a form of listening so sharp it cuts. Every careless word they spoke sharpened my resolve. Every dismissive glance clarified my purpose. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was preparing. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. There were no late-night confrontations, no emotional speeches in the mirror. It looked like routine, like pouring tea, like folding laundry, like sitting beside my husband, holding his hand, memorizing the steady rhythm of his breath. Inside, however, my mind worked with a precision I hadn't felt in years. I had been an archivist once. I knew how to handle facts, how to trace histories, how to let documents speak when emotions failed. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs context. And context, when revealed at the right moment, becomes unstoppable. I knew who to call. I knew which questions to ask. And most importantly, I knew when not to act. Patience wasn't passive anymore. It was tactical. The turning point came quietly, disguised as concern. They sat me down and spoke gently about my future, about comfort and care, about a place where I wouldn't have to worry anymore, a residence, a room, a schedule. They called it kindness. I recognized it for what it was, removal. They wanted me gone, not violently, not publicly, but efficiently, like clearing a room before renovation. I listened. I nodded. I said I needed time to think, and in their relief I saw their fatal mistake. They believed my heart would break. They didn't understand it had already hardened into something unrecognizable. In that moment, the last trace of maternal obligation dissolved, not in anger, but in release. That night, as the house settled into sleep, I stood in the doorway of the room that had once been mine and felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. The secret in the basement was no longer just protection. It was direction. I understood now that power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, and when it finally moves, it does so with devastating precision. My son believed authority came from ownership. His wife believed it came from control. They were both wrong. Authority comes from truth, and truth, once spoken, doesn't negotiate. The silent woman they dismissed was gone. In her place stood someone far more dangerous, a woman who knew exactly what she was about to do, and why. The first call I made wasn't emotional. It was precise. I didn't rehearse what I would say, didn't soften my words with hesitation. I asked for help the way someone asks for a map when they already know the destination. The woman on the other end listened, truly listened, and that alone told me I had chosen correctly. Professionals who understand power don't interrupt. They wait. I laid out the facts calmly. The pressure, the forged kindness, the basement, the documents hidden behind the wall. There was a pause just long enough to feel deliberate. Then she said the words that confirmed everything I had sensed. This changes everything. Not dramatically, not loudly, just definitively. Paper doesn't bruise skin, but it leaves deeper wounds. Contracts, wills, certificates. These are the quiet weapons people underestimate until they're aimed correctly. As I watched copies being made and timelines reconstructed, I felt something shift from inside my chest outward. Fear gave way to structure. Confusion gave way to sequence. My son's confidence, so loud, so careless, had been built on assumptions, on a name he never questioned, on documents he thought didn't exist. The truth, however, had a longer memory than arrogance. Every forged signature, every shortcut, every attempt to erase me left a trace. And traces, once collected, tell stories no one can talk their way out of. Back at home, I returned to my role as background noise. They didn't notice the absence of anxiety in me, didn't hear the quiet certainty in my steps. They were busy planning, talking about sales, about when this is all over, about life after me. That was the irony. They thought I was the obstacle delaying their future, never realizing I was the author rewriting it. I watched my son boast about connections, about reputation, about how these things always work out. He had no idea that reputation is the most fragile currency of all. It doesn't shatter when attacked. It collapses when examined. The day the envelope arrived, I didn't open it immediately. I held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Not in grams, but in consequence. Inside were copies of truths, long buried, now aligned, verified, undeniable. Nothing violent, nothing theatrical. Just facts, dates, signatures, histories that refused to stay silent any longer. I realized then that the most effective justice doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply appears, fully formed, impossible to ignore. My son believed strength meant force. He believed control meant ownership. He was about to learn that paper in the right hands cuts far deeper than any knife ever could. They chose the stage themselves, a gathering. Familiar faces, people whose opinions mattered, business partners, relatives, friends who had known our family name for years. My son stood at the center of it all, confident, composed, performing the role he had perfected, the responsible heir, the patient son, the man burdened by an unreasonable mother. He spoke calmly, carefully, planting doubt without sounding cruel. He talked about concern, about protection, about how easily older minds can be influenced. Heads nodded, sympathy settled into the room like a soft fog. I sat quietly, hands folded, feeling none of the shame he expected. Because when someone builds a narrative too confidently, They rarely prepare for interruption. When my representative stood, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that something real was about to happen. No accusations, no raised voices, just documents placed gently on the table, one by one. A forged deed, a notary who had been dead for years, timelines that didn't align. Silence spread faster than outrage ever could. My son tried to laugh it off at first, the sound thin and misplaced. His wife reached for confidence and found only panic. Because facts don't argue. They don't need emotion. They sit there, unblinking, daring anyone to deny them. And no one did. Then it was my turn. I didn't speak as a victim. I spoke as a custodian of history. I explained, not everything, but enough. About adoption, about protection, about a name given out of love, not entitlement. I never raised my voice. I didn't need to. The contrast did the work for me. A noble letter written decades ago, and a forged document written in greed. Legacy beside theft, truth beside performance. I watched faces change as understanding settled in. Not anger, disappointment. And disappointment, I learned, is far more devastating to someone who lives on approval. The room emptied quickly after that. People avoided eye contact. Conversations died mid-sentence. Partnerships dissolved without argument. My son stood frozen, stripped of the audience he depended on. His name, once an asset, had become a liability in the space of an hour. No shouting, no handcuffs, just exposure. And exposure is ruthless. As I walked out, the air felt cleaner than it had in years. The unmasking wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, surgical, and final. And in that silence, I understood something with startling clarity. Power doesn't belong to those who demand it. It belongs to those who can afford to wait, and then speak once. Truth never arrives without a bill. It doesn't matter how justified it is, how carefully it's revealed. There is always a cost. In the days after the gathering, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls were relearning how to hold silence without tension. My son and his wife moved through the rooms like ghosts, packing without speaking, avoiding my eyes, their confidence stripped down to something brittle and unfamiliar. Phones rang constantly, then stopped. Doors that once opened easily no longer did. I watched all of it from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a heavy, settled calm. Justice, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't celebrate. It simply rearranges the world and leaves you to live in the aftermath. My husband's health declined quietly during that time. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need explanations. We spoke instead about small things, memories from our early years, moments that had nothing to do with names or secrets. Sometimes he would squeeze my hand, as if acknowledging the weight we had both carried in different ways. I never told him everything I had done, every step I had taken. He already knew enough. Love doesn't require full disclosure. It requires understanding. And there was peace in that. The truth had protected him once in life, and now it allowed him rest. That felt like justice, too. As for my son, I saw the reckoning arrive slowly. No dramatic confrontations, no apologies, just distance, the absence of validation. The sudden realization that the world he believed was permanent had been conditional all along. Reputation doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes. Conversations end sooner. Invitations stop coming. Trust evaporates without explanation. And in that erosion, something else disappeared as well. The power he once held over me. Fear only works when it's shared. Mine was gone. I had paid the price of truth already. Years of silence, years of sacrifice. What remained was acceptance. And acceptance is a kind of freedom most people never recognize until they earn it. There were moments, quiet ones, when I asked myself if it had been worth it. If a mother should ever be the one to pull the thread that unravels her child's world. The answer wasn't simple. It still isn't. But I knew this much. Allowing cruelty to go unchallenged doesn't preserve love. It poisons it. The cost of truth was high, yes. It demanded relationships, illusions, futures imagined but never earned. Yet the cost of silence would have been higher. Because silence would have erased me. And surviving by disappearing is not survival at all. It's surrender. And that was something I would never do again. When everything finally settled, the quiet felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just honest. The house breathed again, the way it used to before voices became weapons and love turned conditional. Sunlight moved freely through the rooms, touching old furniture like a familiar hand. I found myself listening, not for footsteps, not for arguments, but for the soft, ordinary sounds of a life continuing. My husband passed away one early morning, peacefully, as if he had simply reached the end of a long sentence and decided not to add another word. I held his hand until it cooled, grateful that the last thing he knew was calm. We buried him beside the man who gave him a name out of love, not ambition. 2 lives bound by quiet courage, resting together at last. My son did not attend the funeral. By then, distance had become permanent. I heard fragments of news through others, moves made in haste, careers rerouted, names spoken more softly than before. There was no satisfaction in it, just closure. Some relationships don't end with shouting or reconciliation. They fade into absence, leaving behind a shape you learn not to touch. I mourned the child I once knew, not the man he became. And in that morning, I released the last thread that tied my worth to his choices. Motherhood had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I was allowed to be something else now. I returned to the basement months later, not as a prison but as a project. The stone walls were cleaned, the shelves replaced, the darkness pushed back by light. What had once held fear now held purpose. I set up a long table, spread out old photographs, letters, documents, the pieces of lives lived quietly, imperfectly, honestly. I had spent decades preserving other people's histories. Now I was preserving my own. On the first page of a new album, I placed a letter about love and sacrifice. On the next, a photograph of myself as a young woman, eyes bright, dreams intact, unaware of how long the road back to herself would be. I smiled at her, not with regret, but with recognition. Freedom, I discovered, doesn't arrive with applause. It comes in small, steady moments. The ability to sit in silence without fear, to look out a window and feel no urgency to justify your existence. I poured tea, watched the garden settle into autumn, and understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Dignity isn't given by children, spouses, or names passed down through generations. It's claimed, often quietly, often late, but always deliberately. My story didn't end in revenge or triumph. It ended in ownership of my home, my history, and my future. And in that quiet, I was finally, completely free.